Hi there, and welcome to Al and Merrill.
My name is Merel, and I like to do deep dives into the latest research on neurodiversity.
And I'm Alistair, psychotherapist. I love creating metaphors and stories to help make sense of it all. And together we're going to be exploring the fascinating world of how neurodiversity shapes our lives. So let's dive in. So this episode of Al and Merrill is brought to you by mycopilot.ai for when your willpower won't. So you know those 2 a.m. moments when you're caught doom scrolling and you know that you should really be going to bed? Or the sofa after work where you've collapsed and you're stuck on your phone? Well, My Copilot AI is your personal AI co-pilot that will help you get on with the things that you really want and need to do in those moments, whether that's doing the laundry, getting on with your projects or hobbies, or going to bed. Check it out at mycopilot.ai.
Just a note to say that we're explorers and storytellers. This podcast is not intended as therapy, advice, recommendation, or medical authority. We are just like you, inviting you along on our journey of trying to make a little sense out of fascinating research on neuroscience and neurodiversity as best as we can.
So hello again.
Hey.
We're doing
Last
these
recording.
in the evening now.
Yeah.
What happened to the recording?
Last recording, I said.
Last recording, absolutely. Last for this season.
For this, yeah.
For this season, hopefully.
Depending on the success levels.
Yeah, I had a conversation with my friend who couldn't understand why we hadn't done the thing of working out the trends in the market and then just working backwards from there. I was telling you about him in our conversation earlier on, not the recorded one, but just earlier. And he works everything out from consequence backwards. And I'm like, that's so interesting because my brain can't do that, right? My ADHD ass cannot think like that. Like I can't think backwards from consequences because it doesn't wire up. But he was like, why? How the hell are you recording anything without having worked out trends? I'm like, well, because, and we had a whopping great big argument about this, which was hilarious because I'm like, yeah, but we're doing it because we can and we like it and we're enjoying it. Like, isn't that where you start? He's like, no, you have to work backwards. That was a really interesting, very different cognitive styles.
Well, I think in some way we're still working backwards. It's just that the goal is different. Because his goal is clearly having as many listeners as we possibly can, or even making money from it. I don't know, something along those lines. And I think our objective is something like having a proper reason to read all the literature that is cool and talk about it and just having interesting conversations and get smarter and get more information and those kinds of things. And I think we do have a goal along those lines, and we're still kind of in some way working backwards from there by giving it this shape, like
I
giving
agree.
our conversations this shape that we do.
I certainly feel like we have a strong intention. Like
Yeah,
I really
I
love
think it's just
talking
a
about this
different goal.
stuff. It's just, let's find out how many people actually want to listen to this, which is different from
At least, and
the other way around.
for me at least, that's not my goal. I mean, it would be a nice kind of extra effect of the conversations if we can also educate other people with it.
And maybe find some interesting people. That would also be a nice one.
That
Create
would
a
also
little
be a nice one.
community, create a little bit of, you never know who you're going to meet online or in real life. You have to kind of put these things out there and see what happens. So I kind of see this as putting something out that's like an authentic expression of our interests. Like this is stuff we like talking about. So let's put it out there.
Please come find us if you have the same interest.
And if you like this as well, then great. And it might only be a small, dinner table's worth of people. But hey, that's a great dinner table right there. So I'll take it.
And especially if we can find people who actually know, like, are more educated than we are on these topics. That would be especially
cool.
great.
If we could interview next season, maybe a couple of people who are like
Who actually know the stuff.
experts in certain areas. Well, we'll see. Maybe. Speaking of themes and intentions and the things that we like talking about, what do we like talking about today?
So in previous episodes, we've kind of dived into quite specific elements, such as specific neurotransmitters, specific proteins, amino acids, a lot of very specific things. And I was thinking maybe just talk a bit more broadly about like the prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum, just like what is happening. What do we see happening in the development of the brain in general in people with ADHD and autism? One of the articles that I read states that there seems to be kind of a discussion or maybe disagreement or at least uncertainty about whether autism and ADHD are really separate disorders or like a single disorder that's part of a continuum that's kind of on the same scale of dysregulations, and that we're just not like certain which it is. But that there's a few things that like we can distinguish, but which still don't really answer the question whether it's the same thing. Because like on the one hand, there seem to be the same genes impacted in both disorders. So there's this. Let me look at it. Like contactin associated protein 2. That's a specific protein coding gene, which is impacted in both ADHD and autism. So this is just one of the examples of genes that we see that are impacted in both disorders, which kind of gets a hint to that genetically the same thing is going wrong, having an impact on, well, in this case, proteins, but there can be many things. So that kind of hints in the direction of maybe it is the same thing, but just a different part of the spectrum. Then there's other things, for example, the amygdala seems to be mainly implicated in people with autism, but not really in ADHD. So then there's parts of the brain such as those which suggest that it really is a different thing, because if it was the same thing, then you would at least see all the same areas maybe impacted, maybe in a different way, but they would be impacted. And the same thing is that we see in the cerebellum, that we kind of see the same starting point in a way that of gray mass reductions and similar ways of the cerebellum being impacted, but all the areas that are impacted are different. So in people with autism and ADHD, different areas, different parts of the cerebellum, we see reductions in gray mass, which also
That's
corresponds to, and these areas also
I didn't even know
correspond to like what we think these areas are doing. So for example, the parts that we think are responsible for motor coordination or for language or for time management or for
Actually, that kind of makes sense.
there's all these different areas that we think are responsible for certain things, and those also correspond to what we see in people with autism or ADHD, like what their deficiencies are. And those different areas, and those are different. There's almost no overlap in the areas of the cerebellum impacted in autism and ADHD.
Unless you have ADHD, which is its
Yes,
own
of course.
thing.
which might just be...
That's different though. ADHD, like I think the general noise on ADHD is like it's not as simple as being you have both autism and ADHD, because it's distinct in its own right.
Yeah, and I think that might be the main thing why this is such a complicated question. Like, because how does this spectrum work? Like, is it are ADHD and autism on the same spectrum, and is it like a triangle where you kind of...
Well, this brings me back to my little trade-off theory, which admittedly is kind of like I can't remember where I first got the idea from this, but it's sort of me, but building on what people have been saying. I just don't know who originally got it from. When we talk about these things, I think a lot of people really flatten the assessment of these labels. So at one end of the sort of phenomenal scale, you've got the expression, the behavior, the specific outcome. So for example, different social management, or with ADHD, some levels of impulsivity and hyperactivity. So that's an expression. And that's where most of our research starts, where we notice that some people fall into this bucket of, hyperexpression or superexpression or overexpression or underexpression of certain behaviors that we consider normal. And at the very opposite end of that, we have, genes, like the fundamental substrates that we're like, okay, this is like the atomic building blocks. You don't really get to go further back than that, because everything about our body is built off genes and stuff. I don't think that's actually true, to be honest with you, though, because actually we start as genes inside a fully functioning cell that is the egg, which is itself generated by the mother, which is generated when she was in the womb. And so I think we often forget that the factory, the actual structure of the cell already exists. It's not created out of nothing. There's a lot there. So I think part of the focus on genes is probably, if we go 100 years into the future, we'll have put it in its place a bit more, given that the context of what does stuff with the genes matters as much. But so we're about hyper focused on genes, and we're hyper focused on behavior expression. But there's a lot of layers in between where different systems, different biochemistry you can change, like we've been talking about the permeability membranes. You can change something really fundamental like that through genes that is used in multiple places in the body and has an impact. So I think that part of the struggle, why this is a struggle, why people are like, what is it? Is because we're not really giving credence to like the vast number of layers of of stuff that needs to happen before you get to behavior from genes. It's not as simple as, gene codes for this behavior. And that's a mistake that people often make when we're trying to storytell about this, because we're trying to find easy stories and those layers make it complicated. Which leads me to the trade-off theory, which is that I think kind of like brains are... Let me give a totally different example about how you can have a propensity for something, but it comes out differently. So autoimmune conditions. I've heard it said that if you've got a likelihood of having an autoimmune condition, then you have like a baseline likelihood of having that. The specific one that your body develops is a dice roll on top of that. So you could end up... So I've got vitiligo, which is like a pigment thing. Could have had MS. Or MS, I think. Like you can have different ones, but you've got a baseline probability of developing one of them in the first place.
Of developing any of those.
Of developing anything, like having an immune system that's like a bit hyper, but then your immune system gets like, it picks that one. And once it's picked one, it's kind of not used up, but there's only so much stuff that your body can do. So when I look at the behavior of different neurodiversities, and I throw into the mix things like, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, that I know people who are dyslexic, and I'm like, how about you are 100% neurodiverse, but they're not quite ADHD and they're not quite autistic. They're dyslexic. And I think that's a particular type of neurodiversity itself. And we don't talk about it, but it's got very particular quality. Because I think what happens is that your brain, when it's developing, you have only a certain amount of energy and developmental opportunity when you're growing. Your brain can't actually develop in all the cognitive directions that a brain can. It has to pick some paths. And depending on which paths it picks, you end up going down different routes. So I think that we could have a genetic propensity towards some kind of low substrate modification that's genetic, where there's some struggle, some pressure for the system not being able to adapt normally. And there might be a few distinct developmental paths that the brain can choose to adapt to that pressure. Let's say that pressure is the fact that it can't, there's an energy profile problem, and it has to discard something that it can't build properly. Well, different brains discard different things depending on which environment they're in. Some of them might discard time, like time management, which is going to make you look very ADHD, because ADHD is madly about time. Some of them might discard things like social stuff, which is going to make you look really autistic. Some of them are going to be time, a different type of time, short-term working memory. That's going to make you look dyslexic because it means you can't follow characters. And there's a strong correlation between dyslexia and working memory. And the cerebellum being the pattern matching thing that learns how to do pattern matching. If your brain has made a decision to essentially throw away a certain part of functioning and just be good enough but not really excellent, then the cerebellum is going to reflect that because it's encoding what it can, and it will therefore look different. So we might see these different expressions in the cerebellum and be like, oh, that's causing it. It's like, well, no. The trade-off that the brain made in development meant that the cerebellum developed like that to facilitate those trade-offs. Like it facilitated the thing that it really paid attention to, and it dropped the things that it didn't. And we see distinction between ADHD and autism because potentially, in this little theory, or dyslexia, or others, those different brains made big trade-offs of classic core central processing units of the brain that have strong, consistent correlates with the cerebellum. So, if your dopamine is a trade-off because it's really expensive to build that, or really difficult to build that, or you're really stressed, or you're flooded with cortisol or whatever, you're going to impact the basal ganglia, you're going to impact the dopaminergic cells in the cerebellum, you're going to get ADHD pathology out the other end. But if you were fine on that, but stressed in another way, you might just end up looking autistic. So I think there's an element where I'm like, this whole question of is it one or is it the other? Yeah, it's sort of like that question falls out really only when we've got a simplified structure of analysis of how do the genes influence the behavior. It's like, there are many routes. Like, which road did you take to get from London to Birmingham? There are a number of different roads you could have taken. On one of them, you got wet because it's a wet road. And then you end up the other end going, yes, but how did you get to London and Birmingham? One person's dry and one person's wet. And it's very confusing. It's like, because one took a different road. So that's kind of my little idea on trade-offs, where I think the brain just can't develop everything for some fundamental substrate reason where something isn't working properly. So it just has to make decisions. And whatever it loses is kind of your definition of your particular flavor of neurodiversity. And there are certain major trade-offs that commonly get made that your brain goes, this whole organ can just like, we're just not doing time, we're just not doing social, we're not doing this stuff, we're not doing body movement, you're going to get dyspraxia. To me, that makes sense of it. It doesn't answer a lot of questions. Like there's a lot of questions still begged by this approach, like the details, the specific mechanics, the specific roads. Great. Okay, so there are many roads. Which ones? Where do they go? Which ones are the wet ones? Which ones go over the high part? All those questions still remain open. But as a principle, as a way of looking at the question and understanding why we get different behaviors for different genes, that's where I would lean to.
And it would not explain maybe, but it would correspond to these same genes being impacted in multiple disorders, and also why, for example, a parent with ADHD has a higher probability of getting a child with autism, or the other way around. Like both are very probable, which makes it, well, by far more likely that genetically maybe the same things are happening, but that at some point in the development of a child, things happen that kind of divert these roads of development, and either one of the two or one of many symptoms may be the effect. One of the other things that was mentioned as a difference between autism and ADHD was the path of like the speed basically of brain development. So I think last recording I already said something about the development speed of autistic brains, that there's kind of this window between I think 2 and 4 years old or something where they just grow dramatically. And what this article also says is that their brain starts off usually a bit smaller, or at least equal size or slightly smaller than the brains of most neurotypical children. Then the fast growing starts before the age of 4. Then it keeps growing much faster than the other brains until adolescence, and then they will keep having a larger brain or a more heavier brain for the rest of their lives than neurotypical people, probably as a result of less pruning happening. On the other hand, people with ADHD usually have a smaller brain than neurotypical people. So they have a 4 to 7%. I'm not sure if I think it's volume, but I'm not sure what that exactly means in terms of brain, but they tend to have a smaller brain, or at least I think this was age matched. So smaller brain compared to people of the same age, which might mean that I think this was on children. So I think adults might have the same size. I'm not sure.
So maybe
but
it
at
comes
least
later.
Yeah, there's also theories who say that the brains of people with ADHD are slowly maturing, basically, so that they are a few years behind in terms of the growth development process that the brains of children are supposed to have.
So I'm kind of seeing an analogy here with like my little road metaphor. Like it's almost like autistic people get on a motorway and they kind of just get there faster and they, bigger. And I don't know if in this sort of hypothetical world, being on different roads, the longer that you're on roads, the more like stuff your car attracts, or the less bugs you get on the road. It's some kind of consequence of picking a different road. You have to stop more, your brakes get worn down more, your rubber gets worn off more on the wheels. Maybe neurotypicals take like the A roads, and maybe the ADHDers are like just bombing around on the back B roads, getting completely lost, and eventually they arrive at the destination. They're like, oh man, that was a mission. The autistic people got there first. It's like, why is everyone taking so long? I'm already here.
But they all also got a lot of trash with them. They all picked up the first flies that were bumping into their screen, their
Exactly.
glasses.
So the road taken makes a big difference to the outcome. Something that popped to mind also while you were speaking there that I happened to come across again yesterday, I was thinking about this quite personally actually, is the correlation between the age of the father and intensity of autism symptoms, or likelihood of autism symptoms in offspring. And there's a graph, and so the older that the mum is, the more likely the child is to have neurodiversity symptoms. But the gradient of the graph and how far it goes is like, it's a lot less. And then the impact of the father is like, it starts in roughly the same place, and then it goes up much steeper and much further than the line for women. I can't remember exactly what each side represented, but the take home, each axis represented exactly. But the take home is basically like that the older the parents, and most certainly the father, the more likelihood there is that the child will have neurodiversity expressions. And obviously, as a over 40 and, still thinking of kids, I'm like, chances of having autistic children is way higher. Whereas if I'd had kids if I was 20, there's a reasonable chance that those symptoms would have been less. And interestingly enough, this may partly explain why we're seeing more neurodiversity in our society, because people are having kids older and older and older. So there's extra 10 years, the average age of having kids from 22 to like 32. That's going to have an impact, especially with the dads being older. So this also then becomes a question of like, yeah, but hold on, how? Like, because does that change the genes? Is it oxidation or methylation of the genetic material? Is it epigenetics? Like what? Because the fundamental genes aren't changing, right? The core genetic instruction set from the father, yeah, it's mixed. Or do certain parts of the chromosomes get selected for less in sperm later? Like, to me, I'm like, if we're going to talk about genes, that little bit of data about the age of man starts begging some really big questions around what the driving force here is.
It could have to do with the barrier between the blood and the testicles.
Wouldn't be surprised more toxins and getting in, more stuff.
Like if you're 10, if you've lived for 10 extra years, then you've probably ingested more toxic.
Is it
things.
toxins, or is it maybe like something that your body creates, those enzymes we're talking about that just leak across, and then that impacts? But then
anything that has gotten into your body or has been created inside your body.
Right. So then this might not be genetic. My comment earlier on about the mother's cell being already existent, well, the sperm goes into the cell. If the sperm introduces more autistic bits, whatever they are, like midi-chlorians, but autistic-chlorians, like if that passes on, what if it isn't genetic? What if it's something in the very structure of the cell about how genes are expressed and like how some of the sort of factory circuitry, the mechanics of cells changes? We're talking about things being fast, things being slow. What if it has more like speed enabling autistic-chlorians that mean that it can grow faster? Because it's, a lot of what we were talking about in a few sessions ago was, when we were talking about vitamin D3 and K2, you need the K2 was it to chill out the vitamin D3 or to enable it?
To let it be used by the bones to make it absorb it, being absorbed by the bones.
So the presence of the K2 is actually a catalytic effect on another process. It's not direct, right? It's changing the behavior of a different process. So much of our body is like that. So much of our body is about things changing the behavior of another thing, which changes the behavior of another thing, and so on and so on and so on. So if the sperm does have more of these autistic-chlorians, I'm so sorry about that, but it's stuck in my head now, then maybe that's what it does. Like it speeds up, and maybe it only applies when it gets into the nerves. Maybe it has no impact when it's there in liver cells. Liver cells just go, yeah, I don't care. But nerve cells react to this stuff and something changes, and they, there's a growth factor there. I mean, there's so many questions that are begged by all this research. I think we're very much at the beginning of a journey, but yeah. I didn't have a conclusion there, though. That didn't lead to a kind of nice, simple story. It actually, it's almost the other way around. It's where the story just begs lots of questions.
Don't get children when you're old.
All right, thanks.
Well, that's what your point was.
Well, implied in what you're saying there was a very strong judgment that that don't get children because they might have autism.
Well, if you want to have children, better have them.
You're still assuming that autism is bad. What would the world look like, though, if we got rid of all the neurotypicals and just like had everyone being autistic and like, ethical and based on principles and actually acting on them, as opposed to the sort of crazy type of nonsense that neurotypicals often do and get up to? I think there's some interesting arguments there. Maybe autistic people don't actually, we should get rid of the neurotypicals. Yeah, just saying.
They should be complemented with people with ADHD, though. If we would only have autistic people, then everyone would be doing their own projects and probably like reinvent the wheel thousands of times.
Yeah, you may have a point. I mean, obviously, as an ADHD person,
I would.
I think having a bit of both is fine. But I think a well-balanced, I don't know, it's probably a evolutionary balancing factor where if any of them become too much, then it changes the nature of the game. I was just trying to make a joke, really, to be honest with you, given that you attacked me about being old and still wanting kids.
I wasn't intending
Thanks.
to attack you.
Just throw me in the bin while you're at it. Don't mind me. I'll just huddle there
You were
until they pick
complaining
it up.
about not making a point. And I thought, well, it sounded like that was the point
I
you were
definitely
making.
wasn't trying to make that point. I don't think. Or maybe I was. Maybe it just hurts a bit too much, so I didn't want to. Just be aware that if you're older, your kids are likely to be more on the neurodiversity spectrum, and that may influence your parenting style or priorities. Anyway, what else did you have on your research that we were going to talk about today?
Yeah, there was some stuff which I don't fully get, but I think that's fine.
No, we'll just add it to the mix of all the other things we've spoken about in the previous thing. Like, we've gone and understood loads of things and told stories, and at the end of it, I've still walked away going, yeah, but hold on, what? Like, I've got so many more questions than I started with.
There is some stuff about functional connectivity. Ooh, that one's actually quite interesting. I'm just going to tell something else than I just started with, because I actually found.
Oh, look, squirrel. Okay, let's chase the squirrel. Let's chase the squirrel.
I have never heard of a medication for autism, which I think still isn't
No, me
existent.
neither.
But they did an experiment with 2017. This paper was published where they tested the effects of the drug Riluzole on people with autism. Riluzole is a drug which is, I looked it up, which is commonly used for ALS, for muscle, for a disease where your muscles basically stop contracting. But apparently it is also influencing GABA. So this GABA,
Famous GABA. Useful for everything.
by apparently, so this drug also influences this balance between GABA and, what was it, glutamate, which was important for regulating the brain, basically.
So just as a reminder for anyone who's listening, that we were looking at in a previous session, and basically is fundamental sort of basic building blocks of how synapses work. Like, you need glutamate and GABA to make things go backwards and forwards across synapses. Otherwise, there are no sparky bits between your neurons.
Yeah. So this riluzole is influencing this balance. And by that, it alters functional connectivity. So it basically increased for the people with autism, it increased the low prefrontal connectivity to be equal to the levels of the control group. So there's a control group, obviously, with people without any.
Hold on, so it changed the
autism.
connectivity. Like, it
Yes,
fundamentally
it did.
changed the actual amount of.
And
Like,
after the treatment, they
sparky
couldn't find
connections.
After the
Wow.
treatment, they couldn't find a difference. It's a statistically significant difference between the control group and the autistic group. And by
that
that,
in what time frame? Does it say? Does it say it's like, 1 week, 12 weeks, years? Is it
a matter
long
of
term?
weeks. I don't know how many weeks, but it's a certain
Be
amount of
interesting if
weeks.
that's a long term impact, or whether it then reverts, like if there's a baseline, because then it would imply, like, did it not get there in the first place, or is there some pressure for it to be in a different place?
I think that the drug has quite a lot of it's got loads of side effects. So I don't think the point of the paper is that riluzole should be used by autistic people to fix it or whatever. But what is interesting is that, like, there is a question of whether the brain issues in autism are either like a failure to establish certain connections, or what we've talked about earlier as well, that things that were already there are destroyed or are disabled, or like whether it's a defect of building the brain, or that the brain is basically being destroyed or deactivated in certain ways that make it incapable of certain things. And basically that this drug is re-establishing actually, or is establishing connections that, and making the brain look from some perspective exactly the same as that of neurotypicals, kind of implies that it's more likely that it's a weakening, that the connections or the brain structure is actually
Or
there.
I'm disinhibiting.
Yeah. So that the brain is actually built the same way, I want to say, but maybe it's different, but like is capable of being the same, or is in some way built the same, but probably deactivated or inhibited, or.
Yeah, I don't know. That has some question, because again, I mean, my core question is still, we call neurotypical the baseline for reasons that are themselves potentially a bit suspect. So maybe the gift of autism is that, well, let's say someone has super hearing, they're just amazing hearing, and what this thing does is go and put wads of cotton wool in the ears, and you're like, that's more normal. And we're like, yeah, but we just put cotton wool in someone's ears and they had like an amazing hearing before that. You'd be wondering whether that was the right thing to do. So I'm like, I think your question is absolutely sound. Is it a disinhibiting? Is it an inhibiting? Is it a supporting, a creating, a making up for? Is it temporary? Is it long term? Like, if we could answer some of those questions, it would tell us a lot more about the nature of autism and why it's different, and also how we might want to value autism versus neurodiversity.
That's why I said I also don't think the point of the paper is that people with autism should start taking this drug, but it can tell us something about like what might be happening, why we behave differently, why the brain is working differently, and what we could possibly do about it, maybe if we would want to.
I think it's also interesting that this thing has lots of other side effects, because that then it could be for at least one of at least two reasons. One of them could be this thing just has other side effects coincidentally, and we could, in theory, isolate this particular thing if we had better chemistry and whatever. The other option is that potentially the reason that it's making that impact on the brain and bringing those neural connections into the same sort of zone as neurotypicals might be because it's changing something fundamental that also changes something fundamental in other parts of the body that goes, don't do that because you're breaking all these other bits, which would then be like, well, the brain maybe did the trade-off to try and make everything else work in development. It was like, and now if we come back and we're like, yes, but we want to selectively only do this, and the brain's like, yeah, but they're all actually the same. That was just the one that I traded off for some random developmental reason. But if you try and fix it now, you're going to break everything because we're changing the substrate, not the decision that was made back when in a moment. It's like trying to fix something in the house. So I don't know if you've ever owned a house and tried to fix things. The number of times that you try and fix something and basically you have to kind of stop before you fix everything, because if you actually put on the string of all the broken things, you'll end up tearing your house down and rebuilding it from scratch because they're all broken. They're all built weird, especially houses like mine in Bristol, which are built weird. You can't fix everything. You have to kind of stop, because if you try and fix everything, then you just have to start building a new house from scratch. And I don't think we can rebuild people from scratch. And it's probably not on the cards. Are we changing foundations to try and fix a wonky fireplace? You can tell my British house bias there.
Another interesting point that this specific paper is making, by the way, is how drugs in general are developed. That's not the point, but that's the topic. Because what they found is that this drug, this Riluzole that they were giving to people with autism and also to controls who didn't have autism, increased GABA in all the people with autism in their group, but decreased it in controls. So it had a different physical effect when giving it to people with or without autism. And a big point that the paper is making in their discussion is, if we keep developing drugs on neurotypical people, like testing them and developing bystanders of neurotypical people for people with something else, that is like, if we should develop, if we want to help certain people, we should develop the drugs for that being
I think
tested.
this is a really, really difficult one. And the thing, I bang on about this all the time with anyone who listens, really, because what I studied at uni was complex systems, and specifically what we were trying to do, and I had a very small part in, was, can we even come up with any maths that can interrogate complex systems? Because at the moment we can't, right? We can't solve complex systems because they're too complicated for our maths. Our maths just literally is not good enough. So the way that we work with complex systems is we do statistical analyses and we simulate them, and then we do stats on the simulations. That's as good as we get. But I've heard it said by someone, I don't know if I entirely agree, but they said there is no such thing as probability in nature. Like, we just don't know enough. But the problem, particularly where we're talking about human beings who are incredibly complex, right? The layers of biology and chemistry that underpin us is vast, like vast beyond imagining. And we're trying to mess with that when we don't have the tools. Right? We just do not have the mathematical tools. So we make these statistical inferences. So, Big Pharma uses stats, but how do you know how to break those populations apart to do more direct stuff when actually you're still doing stats? You're just doing it on a different population. So I entirely agree with what you said, but I think that part of the real struggle that we have as human beings at our current level of knowledge is that we really don't have the tools to come up with better science at the moment on how to do this. So, because it could be the case that we need a drug that's just there for neurotypicals, but not when they are, not if they've had one child or have brown hair or, I don't know, drank Fanta when they were kids, like some random stuff, right? That they grew up on rice or wheat, so they've got a different gut microbiome. The levels of confounding variables, the things that have an impact, is so enormous. We really haven't. I mean, most of the stuff that we know in research is based on white, young, 20-something men. So, the number of demographics that are not well represented by our modern medicine is pretty substantial. It includes, for example, all women. Anyone who's not white, anyone who's not neurotypical, anyone who's not somewhere between 20 and 40. Yeah. No, I'm used to say I've got no answers. I'm in a whimsical interrogative mood. Sorry, listeners, I've got no good answers for you today. Just more weird analogies and an equal amount of confusion.
One of the other articles that I found for today is mentioning something about areas of the brain. The thing they're mentioning is the precuneus. It's in the default mode network.
I can't believe we haven't spoken about the default mode network yet. How did we get to episode 11 without even mentioning the default mode network? That is so important.
And what they say is that people with ADHD show heightened activation in areas such as this precuneus, I don't know, basically. And what they say is that it indicates difficulties in deactivating the default mode network. So what they're basically saying is there's a lack of inhibition of when this network is activated, or I don't know how you're supposed to say that, but if stuff is happening there, then people with ADHD generally have difficulties with kind of deactivating it again, with stopping
sort of regulation.
What's happening there.
Just did a quick Google on this. First off, the precuneus is sort of towards the back. It's so it's sort of like just past the back of the crown of your head, very much at the back. So nothing to do with the prefrontal cortex, or not co-located with it at all, but very much on the outside the surface. Core component of the default mode network connects with many brain regions in the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital cortex. So it's, again, a bit like the cerebellum. It's sort of connected with everything. It's one of the brain structures with the highest resting metabolic rates, so it's always busy, and it's been proposed that it is involved in the neural correlates of self-consciousness and that it's engaged in self-related mental representations during rest, which is interesting because I would have guessed, I thought that was the sort of stuff that the prefrontal cortex was doing. But actually, that's all the way back here, which completely breaks my model of the brain because I've always thought that stuff happened towards the front. That's interesting. So memory, mental imagery, self-processing, attention, voluntary attention in particular, and affective response to pain. So this feels like an area that is hyper-wired again. Funnily enough, isn't it strange how anytime we look at a part of the brain, we realize that it's wired with loads of other parts of the brain? It's almost like this stuff isn't really simple and decomposable into simple functional units. Crazy. I'm suddenly extremely interested in this part of the brain. Well, I didn't know about it. Hello. Now I've got another picture of it that's put it in a different location yet again. Oh no, hold on. The brain's pointing the other direction on that one. I've got goosebumps. And we are saying that the precuneus is, what's the correlation with ADHD or autism?
People with ADHD have heightened activation in this area, as opposed to...
So we're making it work hard.
I think longer. They have difficulties in deactivating this area, they're saying. So
this area could be associated with like that rumination quality that ADHDers have, where everything's just always on and we're always thinking, we're always self-reflecting, we're always hyper-aware of self, always like in conversations, notoriously, neurotypicals are wandering along and not thinking about too much stuff, and an ADHD will be there analyzing everything about the social exchange to understand how they're getting it wrong, usually, and also having a whole extra thought process around self-judgment. So that's this part of the brain.
And then also the frontal lobes pars opercularis, which is vital for inhibitory control, it says, which is smaller, people with ADHD, which was also corresponding, but that's a different type of inhibition. That was more about inhibition of task, of not of thought. So I think this precuneus and default mode network were more about like the experiencing of things that's just going on all the time. And this pars opercularis in the frontal lobe is more about inhibition of activity of so they tested it with a go no go task where I think they let people hear a sound or there's some impulse that people need to respond to or are doing a thing, and then there's a stimulus which says that they need to stop doing the thing immediately and then continue and then like go and no go and no and go and stop and go and stop, and that the people with ADHD were responding to that slower because this part of the brain which is
It's already
required
overloaded.
for probably. So it's that's a different kind of, because I think that that's just like similar to this area that we talked about previously, is that it just kind of goes on. There's an issue with inhibiting the brain activation that's happening at that moment. Like it's probably slightly slower. It's not that the people
I think
can't
this is.
stop doing something, but
I'm looking at this picture of the brain here,
Mhm.
and that whole like what you're describing there is it's so the lived experience, isn't it? It's like this is the stuff that we struggle with. It's like suddenly we're talking about something that's less about the deep information processing. We're talking less about the thing, the biochemistry of it, and we're getting into a layer of feels much more behavioral, right? This is people will recognize this and be, I get frustrated by that. Whereas most people aren't like, yeah, do you know what? Like on Sundays, I can so sense that my GABA is just really not like, like we've been really down in the bowels of like some of the chemistry really. And this is like, we're now sort of touching on the areas of the neocortex. And I'm looking at this picture of the neocortex and in my mind, I can kind of like highlight the cerebellum. Okay, that's not the neocortex, but it's down there. The precuneum here with the frontal lobe. I know the amygdala is involved. And I'm like, this is the whole brain now. Like this is everywhere in the brain lighting up. And it really drives that thought, that belief I have that neurodiversity isn't about which part of your brain isn't working, right? Which is the sort of naive, simple assumption. It's like, oh, I've got a bit of my brain that doesn't work. Although actually you can actually trigger ADHD from brain injury, which is interesting. Because it would imply that, if you have a problem in one of these areas, maybe the whole network struggles, right? Because one part of it is damaged. But it is like this big network of different parts of the brain all working together. And I just keep getting this feeling, and it's what I've been saying, it sticks with me, is that it's the substrate. It's what's underneath it all. There's things that impact the entire functional thing. It's like, if you imagine a road network, I use roads a lot, interestingly, as an analogy, but if you imagine a road network where the tarmac is different, like crap roads versus good roads, you're going to see a lot of different traffic behavior and people are going to build different things. You're going to find factories co-located and stuff like in ways that people are going to place, the functional units of society in different places depending on how good the roads are. Because if you've got good roads, you can put them anywhere. And if you don't, you need to put them right next to each other. There's something, I think it's been interesting to be looking at the deeper stuff and that permeability, the enzymes we were talking about, this sort of like the deep drivers, like the GABA, that underpin everything. It's like that's the quality of the tarmac. That's whether the traffic lights work, And this is more looking at like, okay, where do we put the hubs of our city? Which bit of the city produces this and where's it consumed and stuff. And it's a whole other way of looking at it that maybe isn't as, it's not as powerful maybe as an explainer of why we're different, why there's something fundamental going on, why it's not just, us being lazy, or why it's really different, why our experience is profoundly different. But looking at the neocortex neos might tell us how it's different.
And how it
what
translates
that then,
to the experience.
Exactly. I think that for me, that's a very season 2 interesting focus. Just saying, if that happens.
I agree, but I'm also happy that we started with fundamentals because, at least for me, that it puts everything more into context. Like if we're going to talk about experiences, then I prefer to be able to put it into the context of like what is happening fundamentally, and then maybe we can like link it back to what we already know.
Yeah. I think I'm in the
but
same
yeah,
boat there. I think if we started the other way around, we'd be a bit more at sea. There wouldn't be so many anchors or maybe landmarks that we can be like, this feels like it relates to the whatever it is, So if you're listening to this, dear listeners, and you can have an opinion, let us know if you'd like a second one. The very fact that if we ever get responses from you will tell us, A, that you exist. Well, first off, that we actually managed to release this, which would be pretty big win in the first place, given we're both neurodiverse and whatnot. And secondly, that people are listening. That would be really awesome to know. So if you want another season, let us know. Thanks for listening to our podcast today. If you like what we're talking about and want to hear more, do like, follow, and subscribe. It makes a really big difference. You can also find us on social media and our Patreon, Al and Meryl, or our website, alandmeryl.com. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.